Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Seiner, and welcome to a brand new series called Let's Recreate, where we create materials found in everything from popular video games to feature films. Today, we're going to kick off this series with a popular franchise that's taken the video game industry by storm. We're going to create an infected organic material inspired by Naughty Dog's The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. The team at Naughty Dog are masters of their craft. I think both Part 1 and 2 have really pushed the boundaries of what the video game genre is capable of. The storytelling, visuals, audio, gameplay, and technical elements, everything just has completely blown my mind. It was a no-brainer to think of this game as a candidate for the first episode of this series. Now, I realize that this video is a little bit long, so I've left a bunch of chapter markers down in the description and below in that play bar so you can skip around and come back to any parts that you need to later on. I've also linked below a finished version of the graph today that you can download on my Gumroad page. This allows you to either follow along with the video or you can play with the notes to see what everything does. Without further ado, let's see what we're going to create. Alright, so here is the material that we're going to be making today, and you can see it's based on this reference, this image here from Dana Lopez, and you see our entire graph here. It looks a little complex at first, but as soon as we break it down, I assure you it's going to get a lot more simple. So we can see we've got different layers here. We've got these fungus mounds, we've got the wall, we've got these really cool veins. We also have these tendrils here, and if I just Control Shift and right click, we can move the light around. We can see what this material is going to look like. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do was analyze some reference that I've gathered here. I've got two different kinds of reference here, one from Javier Perez, the amazing material artist currently working at Naughty Dog, and also Diana Lopez with this. And this image is actually what I'm going to be basing this material off of because it has such great detail and you can see how it's applied to the wall and everything. And I wanted to kind of break down how I look at this reference and what I'm thinking about as I go through it. So first off, I want to analyze what elements do I need to create and how do I want to approach this. So I'm thinking in terms of elements, we've got this wall here, the blue, cold, dark wall that the fungus is growing on. You can see we've got these hard but also organic, I'm going to call them fungus mounds here. And these are going to be kind of tricky because I know that they need to seem hard, but also organic and have a soft element to them. So that's going to be fun to try to recreate. So another element that I'm looking at here are these awesome veins, the smaller tendrils that are clinging onto the wall and connecting everything together. We also have a good example of these veins in Javier's materials here, where I've come up with a really neat idea of how to create these small veins and connecting tubes, and that's gonna be really fun to make. Then finally, if we zoom in here, you see we have these bigger veins or these larger, what I'm gonna call tendrils, that can connect all these different fungus mounds together. And with those few elements, we can easily create this material. Something else that I'm looking at here is how this light, in this case it's a flashlight, how it's reflecting the roughness of the material. We can see that the tendrils are the most shiny part here. You can see we've got a little bit of shiny reflections coming off of the fungus mounds and also the veins as well. So we're getting that kind of slimy, organic feeling mixed with the rougher fungus mound texture here. So like I was saying before, the challenging part for this material is probably going to be to create this sort of organic mushroom, fungus, overgrown, infected feeling. Give it that hardness, but also give it sort of an organic feel like it was once alive or is currently alive in some way or another. I'm also thinking about how this material is going to be applied and used when either the environment artist or character artist is going to apply this material. How are they going to use it? And so I'm thinking the way to use it would be doing some vertex painting like you would in Unreal Engine, where you could have one version of the material that's just the wall, another version which could be the veins, and then another version that could have everything on it, including the fungus and the tendrils and things like that. And you can blend these materials together or on top of one another. Also, I want to be able to use the random seed slider in Substance Designer so that when we just change that random seed, we can get a completely different variation. The tendrils are in a different place, the mounds look different, but they all kind of look as if they all go together. So I'm going to approach this material as if it were made up of layers. So starting with the wall, then the veins, then the fungus, and finally the tendrils. So let's get out of this reference and let's get back into Substance Designer. Okay, so back in Substance Designer, let's create a new graph. So File, New Substance, and I'm going to choose the PBR Metallic Roughness template, and let's call this Infected Fungus Tutorial. I'm going to choose 4K, so 4096 by 4096. The size mode I'm going to have set to relative to parent, and the format is 16 bits per channel. And let's hit OK. So if you'd like to get a setup that's similar to mine, I'm going to be using a rounded cylinder. So to do that, go to your 3D view, go to Scene, and then choose Rounded Cylinder here. So the first thing we're going to do is create the height information, and we're going to build everything from that. And so the way I like to work is I like to have a blend node here that connects into my normal information, my ambient occlusion information, and my height information. So I'm going to do that now. I call this the final blend. So spacebar, blend, and let's connect this to the normal conversion node here. And let's remove these two default uniform colors connected to our ambient occlusion and height. So just delete. And so I'm going to connect the blend into the height first. And then before I connect it to the ambient occlusion, I need to create an ambient occlusion node. So spacebar, ambient occlusion. And this is a height-based ambient occlusion node that converts the height information and adds those shadows around our objects. So I'm going to connect that conversion node into the ambient occlusion output, and then connect our blend to that ambient occlusion node. Now, as soon as we put some grayscale information into the foreground of this blend, these red dotted lines should clear up and everything should work perfectly. So let's save this. And let's start by creating the wall, the base, the furthest back layer of our material. So I'm going to start off with a moisture noise. So spacebar, moisture noise. This noise is fantastic for creating this sort of mossy or organic kind of creepy basement looking material. And it's a great one for this organic growth that we're going for that just kind of screams like the wall is infested with something. So I'm going to connect this to the foreground of our blend. This is our final blend, and you can see we're starting to get some stuff happening here in our 3D view, but I want to tweak this just a little bit more. So I'm going to double click on the moisture noise, and I'm going to go to this scale parameter. And you see if I bring this up, it technically scales down the noise, and I think I'm going to leave it at 4 here so we can get lots of nice detail. You can see what I'm talking about here with this really creepy looking porous surface we have. So it's looking a bit intense. You can see that we have a lot of peaks and valleys that we have with this noise. And so to flatten this out, let's use a histogram range node. So I'm going to click on my moisture noise, spacebar, histogram range. And this allows me to just flatten out that range of the histogram that we're using. So you can see if I decrease this in our 2D view, it's going to get a lot more gray and dull. And you can see that our peaks and valleys are starting to disappear as it compresses into a more flat material. So I'm going to bring this down. That's looking pretty good for now. 0.27 on the range, and I'm going to keep the position at 0.5. And that looks a bit more reasonable. As we continue to blend this later on, it's going to flatten this out a little bit more. So I want to give it a little more detail, a little more extra depth in the range to play with later on. So I want to add a little more detail to this. So let's blend in another noise. So I'm going to click on my graph, spacebar, type in dirt, and I'm going to choose dirt 1. And dirt 1 has a lot of these small little mounds of dirt and detail here that we can now subtract from our current wall as it is. So what I'll do is I'll select the connection after the histogram range and our moisture noise, hit spacebar, blend, and that automatically puts it into the default input of a blend, which is the background. You can see that small dark gray circle in the input there. That means it's default input. So we have our histogram range in the background. Let's put our dirt into the foreground, and let's change this blending mode to subtract. So now you can see we're subtracting those dots, but it's a little too much, so let's decrease the opacity quite a bit. 0.17. So we have before and after. Just getting a little bit more detail here. So that's everything we need for the wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the nodes that we did, not the final blend, but these ones that we made for the wall, and frame them up by hitting spacebar, typing frame, title this frame wall. And this is what I'm going to refer to as a component. And we're going to build a couple more components that are going to be the layers to the material. So like I said before, we have the wall. Now let's build the next layer, which is the veins. So recently I came up with a really cool way to create a lot of small entangled veins that you can control with shapes or a noise. It's really useful for things like skin, marshes with lots of small rocks, or mutated sci-fi spore-like fungus diseases in a post-apocalyptic world. Luckily, we are making one of those three, so let's make a vein generator with just a couple of nodes. So first off, I want to create some geometry that we're going to use to tell Substance Designer what the shape of these veins are going to be. And I kind of want a lot of veins, but then I want a couple of holes that they're going to surround and leave open. It's a lot more creepy that way, and this will make more sense in a second. So I'm going to hit spacebar, and I'm going to bring in a tile generator. So a tile generator just allows you to repeat a pattern a bunch of times so that it tiles as well really easily. Amazing node. There's a couple of these in Substance Designer that are really useful. Right now we're going to use the tile generator node. So for this tile generator, I'm going to go to the pattern and choose paraboloid or paraboloid, depending on how you pronounce it. And then for the X and Y amount, I'm going to choose something a little bit less. That's too many. So that's how many it's going to tile on the X, how many it's going to tile on the Y. That's good, 7 by 7. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to scroll all the way down here. I'm going to change my blending mode to max. And that's because next what we're going to do is go to the size and just scale this up. Now you can see as I scale them, they blend together a lot better. If I go down to something like add, it's just a bunch of whites, just adding the pixels together. So let's go to max. So I'm going to increase this scale quite a bit. Let's go, yeah, I'm going to type in something like 20. And then I'm going to change the scale random. Just bring this up. This is kind of hard to see, so I'm going to bring the scale down. You can sort of see what's going on. Scale random is just randomizing those circular shapes. Now, keeping the scale down so I can see what I'm doing, I'm going to go to the position settings and change the position random values. So if I bring this on the X, you can see we have random X positions and Y positions. Okay, yeah, that looks pretty random. And then I'm just going to bring my scale back up to something like 20. Now you might not be able to see very much now. You might get the hint of some of those blending points, but we're going to make it a lot easier in a second. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a histogram scan. So a spacebar histogram scan that's connected to our tile generator. I can bring up the position just slightly, and now we're starting to see it better. And I can also bring up the contrast. Now, after this histogram scan, I know we don't see much, but let's bring in an edge detect node. So now we're starting to see what we're doing here. So I'm going to bring the roundness down to 0. Zoom in here. And let's decrease the edge width. Something really thin. In fact, let's just type in a 0.1 value there. So it's really thin on the edge here. And then what we can do after this edge detect is bring in an invert grayscale. So now that should be easier to see. Now, here's where the cool part happens. So let's bring this tile generator over just a little bit. And between the histogram scan and the tile generator, let's bring in a slope blur grayscale. So spacebar, slope blur grayscale. And you see that puts this tile generator into the grayscale input of the slope blur grayscale. And now what I want to drive this slope blur with is a noise called black and white. So B&W spots 1. So I'm going to connect this output and put it into the slope of our slope blur. So in the slope blur, what I want to do is crank up the samples to 32 and bring down the intensity. And let's take a look at our invert grayscale. Okay, that looks a bit strange, so hold on. Let's bring down the intensity. You see if I double click on the invert grayscale to preview and single click on the slope blur, I just change the properties here. And so what I'll do is I'll show you, if I double click on the black and white spots, we have this roughness parameter. If I slide this down, you can see it gets a lot more smooth. So I'll show you what this does. If I double click on the invert grayscale to see what we're doing, and then single click the black and white spots, bring that roughness down. Now we're getting something. Let's change the intensity of our slope blur grayscale. Let's change our mode to min. Change the roughness of our black and white spots, and we can grow these really cool looking vein patterns here. So we're starting to get some cool connections here. So I'll walk through this again. We've got these circles that we've made in the tile generator, and you can start to see those circular patterns appearing here. And we've slope blurred those spheres. We're going to change these histogram values in a second. I can show you what they do. And then we're just using an edge detect. Then once we have the edge detect, we're just inverting it here so we can see what we're doing and get that height information. And so now let's give our vein generator a little bit more information so that we can clean up this mess. You can see we've got a bunch of these pixels around here. So let's clean this up a bit. Before the slope blur, so let's just take this tile generator and push it back out some more. Let's bring in a levels node. And I'm just going to focus this. And I'm going to bring this top left triangle over just a little bit. And to see what I'm doing, I'm going to double click on my invert grayscale again. And I'm just going to adjust our values here. You can see if I slide this over, it gives the vein generator just a little bit more information. Okay, so we've got slightly more solid veins now with this levels, but it's still looking a bit pixelated. So after the invert grayscale, I'm going to bring in a blur. In fact, a blur high quality grayscale. And let's just bring down that intensity. Now we can start to see it's starting to look really cool, like a bunch of cobwebs or entangled veins here. So 0.15 for the intensity, and then let's just bring the quality up to 1. And that's looking really cool. Now that I'm looking at it, I think I want to distort this just a little bit more. So I'm just going to slide this tile generator back just a little bit more, select the connection, and let's bring in a directional warp. Let's push these small circles around just a little bit more. And what I want to warp this by, if I just drag a connection out of the intensity input, is a Perlin noise. So if I double click our blur high quality grayscale to see what we're doing, and then single click the directional warp, I'm going to leave this Perlin noise as default at 32. And let's just increase this intensity here. Bring this up, and you can see we're adding just a little more distortion. In fact, I can crank this up. Let's say I type in 30 in here, and I can really push these shapes. And kind of distort these holes a little bit. That's looking good. Great. So one of the cool things here that you can do is you can always go back to this levels, and you can always change how much information you're giving it. You can decrease the amount of veins, or you can increase. And what you can do is you can go to the histogram scan, and you can change the position here. That's going to increase or decrease that hole size. Change the contrast as well. Get lots of nice control there. And so we're actually going to create 2 variations of this veins generator. So if that didn't quite make sense the way we made it before, we're going to make it again using a noise a little bit later on. So if you want to see what this looks like, we can connect this blur high quality grayscale into our final blend. You can see we've got these really cool looking veins. So like before, I'm going to select all the nodes for our component, spacebar, frame, and call it veins. Okay, so let's try and make these organic fungus mounds. I'm going to start off by clicking in our graph and bringing in another tile generator. So for this tile generator, I'm going to change the pattern back to paraboloid, and I'm going to create some large shapes here. So I'm going to bring down the X amount to something like 7, and yeah, let's bring it up to 12. I want these to be a bit wider than they are tall. Then I'm going to go down again, back to the color parameters and to the blending mode, change this to max. Then to our size parameters and bring up the scale a little bit. Let's say it's something like 2. I'm going to go to the position and go to the position random. And I'm just going to take the position X and Y and bring it all the way to 1. Then let's bring up the scale. I want to bring it up more. Let's see. I'll type in 3 here. And I don't want it too big. Stick to something around 3 there. And then I can take the scale random, just randomize these a bit. What I can do also is go down to color and change the luminance random. That adds some nice variation. Let's go 0.86. That looks good. And now there are way too many shapes here. I don't want to crowd the entire material with these mounds. So I'm going to go down a little bit into the random mask. And this just randomly removes some of our repeating shapes. Great. So believe it or not, this is the basis of our component here. Now I want to create another tile generator. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this tile generator and hit Control D to duplicate. You can also right click and duplicate selection. I want to make some smaller circles. So I'm going to go to the X and Y amount at the top here and bring up the X amount. Say 18. Let's bring up the Y amount. 20 looks good. And I don't want to mask any of these, so I'm just going to go down and remove that random mask, bring that all the way down to 0. So I'm going to use this pattern to directionally warp the larger tile generator shapes. And this is going to create some cool wrinkling organic effects. We'll see in a second. So I'm going to click on my graph, spacebar, directional warp. And so I'm going to be warping this top tile generator with the larger shapes by the tile generator with the smaller shapes. You can see what's happening here. If I increase this intensity, we're getting this cool organic-y push. So I can adjust this warp angle and get some neat shapes out of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in another directional warp. So I'll click on this directional warp, bring in another directional warp, and I'm going to warp it by itself. And this creates this wrinkling effect. If I increase the intensity here, bring it up to something ridiculous like 100. Now we're getting these waves, these kind of wrinkles. That's good for sort of organic wear. Yeah, that looks neat. And let's start to see what we're doing in our 3D view. So I'm just going to connect what we have here to our final blend. That looks interesting. Really cool. Okay. We're getting there. So right now what I'm noticing is these shapes are a little bit too thin, and we need to inflate them. And we can inflate these shapes kind of like a balloon by using a slope blur. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to bring in a slope blur grayscale, and I'm going to bring our directional warp into the grayscale input of the slope blur. But then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take that same directional warp and connect it into a blur high quality grayscale. So we get some nice soft shapes, the same shapes that we're warping here. I'll just bring up the intensity just a little bit, 13.7, and then connect this output into the slope of our slope blur. You can see what this does now. Now we're getting some cool intestine-y like shapes. If I just crank up the samples to 32 and bring down this intensity, you can see what it does. It inflates and pushes out these shapes. So something like 5.05. Let's connect that into our final blend to see what's going on. That's cool. And so I'm noticing right now that I don't have any displacement or tessellation in my 3D view. So to turn that on, I'm going to go to the materials menu in the 3D view, default, and then go to this physically metallic roughness shader and choose tessellation. Then I'm going to go under these height settings. I'm going to crank up the tessellation factor all the way to 16 and just bring up the scale. Notice as I bring up the scale, we start to see some height in our 3D view. So I'm just going to bring this up a little bit like here for now. There we go. We've got some cool sort of organic, intestine-y looking shapes. Now I want to make this, instead of it looking like a balloon, I want to start getting some jaggedy, more hard, sharp properties. So we can do that by adding on another slope blur grayscale after this one. So I'm going to click the one that we have, spacebar, slope blur grayscale. Just bring this out here for some more room. And I want to slope this by a clouds to noise. And not just by itself. I think if I did it by itself, it'd be a little too harsh. So I'm going to blur it a little bit with a blur high quality grayscale. And not too intense, just something small to take the edge off. That's good. So we go from this to this. Let's put it into our slope blur. Double click the slope blur. Now this is way out of control, so let's just crank these samples up to 32 and bring down the intensity. Really small, 0.37. Now our shapes are starting to look a bit more organic, but have some of those harder nicks and notches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to frame up what we have so far. And I'm going to call this base shape. Okay. So next up what I want to do is I want to break this up a bit and add some sort of skin-like flake and breakup. Really gross, but really cool. So I'm going to bring in another Clouds 2 noise, just clicking in my graph. Here we go, Clouds 2. And right away I'm going to slope blur it. So spacebar, slope blur grayscale. And it's going to slope blur itself, bring up the samples. And now check out what happens if I bring down the intensity here. You can get these really small looking flakes just by slope blurring a Clouds 2 by itself. 0.32 on the intensity. And now let's slope blur it again. But this time we're going to inflate these shapes just like we did for the intestine-y like bits down here. So spacebar, slope blur. Get to say fun things like intestine-y bits in tutorials like these. All right, so after the slope blur grayscale, let's bring out another blur high quality grayscale because we're inflating the shapes just like we did before. We don't need a really high intensity. Just bring it way down to something like 1.27 and then put that into the slope of our second slope blur here. Crank up the samples, bring down the intensity. Let's see what we got here. If I just bring this up a tiny bit, we're just going to inflate those flakes a little bit here. You can see that happening up here. 0.26 there. Okay. All right, so these are going to be our flakes. What I'm going to do is after this second slope blur, I'm going to bring in an auto levels. Make sure we have all of the information here in our histogram. And so now what I want to do is I want to filter out these dark patches. And a good way to do that is using a high pass filter. So spacebar, high pass, grayscale. And so now we're just getting those cracks and crevices here. This is what we had before. Now at the high pass, and I can adjust this radius here so I can let more of those darker shapes in or less. We got 6.98 there. That's looking pretty good. And then I want to do one more auto levels after the high pass grayscale. Auto levels. There we go. Great. Now let's blend these flakes onto the base shape that we've created so far. So get a blend node. I'm going to get the auto levels and put it into the foreground and the slope blur grayscale from the base shape of our mounds here into the background. So double click that blur. Let's change the blending mode to min darken. So that looks cool. Let's see what we're doing in our 3D view. So I'm just going to connect the blend that we have so far into the foreground. That looks really cool. It's a bit intense right now, but very neat. So let's go to that blend and let's change the opacity. Just going to lower this down. .11. Those are looking really cool. Okay, what we can do now is actually if we go to our ambient occlusion node that we made at the beginning of the tutorial, and we can just bring up this height depth, and that's going to clarify a lot of what we're doing in our 3D view. So now you can start to see those shapes a bit better, those flakes looking really good. So I'm just going to make another frame here. I'm going to leave this blend out for now, actually. I'll just make a frame for the flakes. And now I kind of want to make it so that these are a bit less. Go back to our reference here. You can see they're not quite as balloony and puffy as we have them here so far. So maybe what we could do is we could subtract and sculpt out some more detail. So I want to show you another way that we can even create some veins that are larger and feel like they're embedded inside these fungus mounds. And so this does have a sort of sculpting effect, which will make the mounds feel a lot more rigid. So we can do this by subtracting some shapes out. So what I want to do is I'm going to take what we have so far. We've got this blend that connects the base shape of our mounds and the flakes. And after it, I'm going to get a safe transform grayscale. So a safe transform, if you don't know, allows you to translate and transform anything that goes inside it, but so that it can always tile. So if I click on my 2D view and hit spacebar, you can see this tiles really well. And if I rotate it, it snaps to those 45 degrees. That makes it so that you can tile this always. You can also bring up the tile option, and that's going to tile it like that. What we're going to do though is we're just going to go to this really cool symmetry option. And I'm going to choose for it to mirror on the X and the Y. Like that. Let's get out of tiling here so we can see what we're doing. So it just kind of rotated and reflected on the X and Y the shape that we have so far. And let's make sure we're not doing any rotation. There we go. So it's just kind of reflected the shape that we have so far, flipped it upside down. And really, I'm just doing this so that I can have a variation of the same height information that we have so far. Now, I want to alter this a little bit. I'm going to bring in a directional warp. So I'm going to select the transform grayscale, directional warp, and I'm going to warp it by itself, just to get a little more variation. Play with the intensity. To get some performance, actually, I'm just going to disconnect this from our 3D view so we can just look at what's going on in our 2D view. So I can just push this now, and that happens a lot faster because we're not trying to process both views at the same time. Okay. And we can shift kind of this weight around with the warp angle. Yeah, something like 79 degrees here. And what I want to do now is bring in a subtle blur. So I'll just bring a blur high quality grayscale and just slightly blur this a little bit so that when we start sculpting things out, it doesn't look like it's too chiseled. So you can see it's kind of, I just want to get like a little bit of blur. That's just helping us with some rough edges that we don't need to deal with later. All right, so now let's start subtracting this. So, got a blend. Let's take what we're subtracting and put it into the foreground. We're subtracting from this blend. This is the blend that we plugged into the safe transform grayscale. So this blend. Let's plug that into the background of our new blend and choose subtract. Now let's plug this into our 3D view so we can see what's going on. Okay, so we've got something cool. Let's change the opacity of the subtract. Now you can see what I was talking about here. We're getting some cool lines like this one here, where it looks like there's sort of a vein or something happening underneath the surface. I can increase the opacity of the blend here. You can start to see that it looks a little bit more like we're chiseling out some information and sculpting in some detail to make this look a lot more solid. Great. So I'm going to take these three nodes here, not the blends, frame those up, and just call this sculpting out detail. And this is what we have so far with our mounds. Okay, so there's two more things that I want to do with these mounds, this mound component. I cannot resist trying to push and morph and squish these just a little bit more. So I'm going to try and doing that, warping it just a little bit with a slight warp. And then I also want to add some tactile detail. Right now it looks really shiny, and that's partly because of the roughness, but also because it's just so smooth. And there's not that much detail really going on the surface. So let's warp this first. Let's make some room. I'm just going to take the final blend that we have here with our outputs and select these, move this way over here. Okay, so we left off here with this blend. This is after we've sculpted out this detail, and I'm going to click on it, spacebar, and I'm going to do another directional warp. You can tell I like using directional warps. And I'm going to warp this by another Perlin noise. So it's looking a bit weird. It's a little too much right now. So let's decrease that intensity quite a bit. Yeah, and then I can change this angle. Just gives us a little bit of these squiggly cracks. So if I go back to the reference, I just want to see, yeah, the edges of these where they kind of mesh together. And I'm just warping it so that I can start to get some similar shapes as to what my reference has. Yeah, it's looking better now. So that's all for that step. I'm going to select those. I like using frames, I like staying organized. Just call this slight warp. And now let's add that tactile detail. So making more room. To get some extra noise and information in here, I'm going to bring in a directional noise. Directional noises are cool because you can choose the direction that it goes in. That makes more sense. So directional noise 1. You can see it looks like wind. It's pushing it in a sort of direction, and you can change this angle of the way that the noise is going. I'm going to keep it at default 0 for now. You can also increase the scale so I can get more detail, just like we did with the noise earlier. I'm going to increase it to 6, looks good. And I can even randomize the angle that that noise is going in to give it some slight variation. Yeah, I'll do 0.07 and just move this disorder around to find kind of just a random, awesome looking noise pattern here. Great. So now I'm going to use another directional warp, but this time I'm going to use it to conform this noise to these shapes. So it looks more like this detail will be attached and conform to the underlying shapes here. So I'll get that directional warp. I'm going to plug in the directional warp from our slight warp frame here into the intensity input because we are warping the directional noise. And so if I increase this intensity, you can kind of see that the shape is now conforming more to the underlying slopes and planes. That's not going to be enough, so I'll type in something like 40. Let's see. Yeah, 40 looks good. And I can change the angle too. Yeah, to make it wrap around more. Cool, minus 23 degrees. And so now I know that this is going to be a bit intense, so what I'm going to do is blur it a little bit. I'll do another blur high quality grayscale. Just a slight blur. 0.45 on the intensity. So now let's blend this on. So I'll just get I'll select the connection right now between the slight warp and the final blend. Spacebar, blend. It puts that slight warp directional warp here into the background. So let's put this blur into the foreground and let's multiply this. See, it's going really crazy now here in the 3D view. Let's bring down the opacity. Really small. This is going to be a very slight surface detail. Great. Now we've got this kind of nice pattern here. It just gives it a little more of that fungusy look. And so now let's group these together, frame it up, and call it tactile detail. So yeah, I'll select all of these, frame it up, and we'll call it fungus mounds. Let's just fix this a little bit, give it some room. And that's our component here. Great, so we have the wall, the veins, and the fungus mounds. Okay, so I mentioned that we're going to create another veins generator, so let's do that now. We're going to make some small veins that are going to sit on top of our large shapes here so that we can integrate everything together after we blend everything in. It's going to look like the veins are kind of crawling through and on top of the large shapes. This time though, we're going to base these veins, instead of on a tile generator, we're going to base it on a noise, and we're going to make them a little bit thicker. So I'm going to go into a blank space up here and bring in my favorite Clouds 2 noise. And I'm going to bring the scale up to 2, so it kind of decreases and adds more detail to the scale here on the Clouds 2 noise. So like before, I'm going to get a slope blur. And what's going to be sloping our clouds is the clouds, but it's going to be blurred with another blur high quality grayscale, just like we used to inflate the shapes before to create those flakes. So let's decrease this quite a bit, 0.63 on the intensity, and then let's plug the blur high quality grayscale into the slope blur grayscale, into that slope input, crank up the samples to 32, and bring down the intensity to something really small. What we're doing is we're creating all of these lines and separations to create those veins, so that our edge detect is going to have lots of fun edges to amplify. You thought I was going to say detect. So 0.63 seems fine. Let's get that edge detect, clicking on the slope blur. Let's bring down the roundness to 0, and let's bring that edge width all the way down to something like, I'm just going to type in 1. I think that's the smallest it goes. Nice. You can see we get really cool looking veins. That could be cool for something like a thorny garden or something, but yeah, you can see now we're getting some really nice veins and awesome tendril looking things. Really cool. But like before, you can see we're getting a bunch of those jaggedy lines. One thing you didn't do before is, instead of bringing in an invert grayscale node, you can invert here right in the edge detect. So if make that from false to true, you can see it reverses black to white. Now, we did add a blur high quality grayscale, but I want to show you another option here to get rid of these extra spots and jaggedy lines. If you hit spacebar and bring in an FXAA grayscale node, you can see that cleans up these lines really well. And these are also stackable, so you can do another one, and that just cleans them up a little bit more. And that's one way to really get rid of those jaggedy lines. If you're having trouble, say in the 3D viewport, and you see that you're getting the stair stepping, you can do that. The difference though with using the FXAA grayscale in this case is there's a lot more information that you can get by using a blur high quality grayscale. So that's just one option. We're going to use the blur high quality grayscale here. So after the edge detect, spacebar blur HQ grayscale. Let's bring down that intensity. There's just a lot more grayscale information this way. We can get our nice, clean shapes. It's also another good way to thicken up these veins. So let's just make it a little bit bigger. And then what we can do is add a histogram scan. And so now if I bring up the position on this, we're going to get some nice, smooth, thicker veins. 0.37 on the position there. So I want these veins to conform to these shapes. Now we used a directional warp last time. We can also use a regular warp node. So I'm going to bring in a warp node here, and I'm going to connect my histogram scan into that warp, and then I'm going to go back to the slight warp here. I'm not going to use this blend here after we added the tactile detail, because that's going to add too much noise into what we need to do. We need the larger shapes here. So the directional warp here and the slight warp, I'm going to branch off another connection and connect it into the gradient input of our warp. And this should distort these a little bit. It looks a little bit crazy here, but you'll see what it does in a second when we put it into our 3D view. Now, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see that the warp is adding more of those jagged lines. So you could do an FXAA node, but I'm just going to do another blur high quality grayscale to keep that extra grayscale information. So blur high quality grayscale after the warp and take down the intensity. So let's blend these new veins onto our fungus mounds. So spacebar blend. In the foreground, we have the blur high quality grayscale. And in the background, we have this blend here at the end after our tactile detail here into the background. And let's multiply it. So we can see what we're doing. Let's just connect this into our final blend. So we can see what we're doing down here. Looks a bit crazy, so let's bring down the opacity. That's really cool. Yeah, that's looking neat. Very more alien now that it has those weird veiny lines on top of it. And after this blend, just to make sure we have all of our grayscale information, I'm going to add an auto levels, just so we have all of our detail. So let's frame this up. And I'm going to call it veins on fungus mounds. Very descriptive. I'm just going to move it up here. And there we go. Just an added detail. You can see how they conform onto the shapes. Really cool. Last but certainly not least, let's add some of those tendrils. So if I go back to the reference, you can see we've got these larger tendrils here branching out. So I want to kind of emulate that here in this material. So first off, to create a tendril, I'm going to make a shape node. So it's a nice big square right now. Let's take the size on the X. Let's squeeze it down. Really thin. 0.12. Now, to add some depth to this flat shape, let's bring in a non-uniform blur grayscale. Incredible node. If I connect the shape into both of these inputs, you can see it now smooths this out and adds some dimension. It's another way of inflating shapes. So I'm going to go down here and just increase the samples to the maximum 16 and the blades to their maximum 9. And I think I'll keep the intensity at 10. Now, we need to blend on some height data that's going to make these tendrils sort of come out from the wall and then do whatever they want to do and then tuck right back into whatever it is they're going. And we can do this by blending on a gradient linear 2 node. So if I bring one in, gradient linear, and choose gradient linear 2, you can see that it does just that. It sticks out, and then at the end, it tucks right back in again. So let's just multiply this onto our new shape. So another blend node. Let's put that in the foreground. Let's put the uniform blur in the background and just change it to multiply. So now it's coming up, doing what it needs to do, right back in again. Now let's warp this around so that it looks like it's all squiggly and tendrily. So spacebar, directional warp. And I'm going to warp this with a Perlin noise. So get another Perlin noise. Connect that into the intensity input. And so if I double click now, you can see it's way out of control. And that's because this Perlin noise is too small. The scale is too large. So if that made sense, I'm just going to bring the scale down so that we get larger shapes. Something, yeah, like 4. So it's a bit more organic. And then we can change this intensity if we wanted to. So I could bring this up to something like 60 and then change the angle if I wanted to, just to get some really cool looking tendril shape. And now what we can do is we can sort of inflate this shape just a bit more. And so one way to bring that out is to use a curve node. So after the directional warp, I'm going to bring in a curve. And curve nodes are good for making pipes or tendrils pop out just a bit more. And we can do that by, here's our curve line. You might have seen this in Photoshop or After Effects. If you double click this to make a point in the center, and then if you look to the left in our 2D view as I do this, I'm just going to bring this up and just extend these points like this. So we get a nice round curve here. And this just pops this tendril. So here's what we had before, and here's what we have now afterwards. much more cohesive. Looks like it's popping out of the woodwork a little bit more now. So let's add some texture onto these tendrils. So I'm going to get a grunge map here. Substance Designer comes with a lot of really great grunges. So I'll type in grunge, we get grunge map, and I'm going to choose grunge map 15. This is an excellent map. So let's blend this on. Get a blend node. Put the curve into the background because I'm blending on the grunge map. And let's set the blending mode to multiply. And we just need a tiny bit of detail. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to plug this into our final blend so we can see what we're doing better. Looks a bit crazy now, I know, but at least we can see the detail. Make sure it's not too much. 0.06. Okay. And now let's use another tile node to create a bunch of copies and strewn these all about across the material. So instead of using a tile generator, I'll show you the tile sampler. Now, the tile sampler is very similar to the tile generator, except it has a bunch of these inputs that you can use. So you can drive the scale, the rotation, the color, the distribution, all from different noises or whatever you want. And you can use these multipliers, like for instance, this scale map multiplier. You can drag this up, and that's going to use whatever noise you plug into the scale map input and drive what you're doing to these squares or whatever kind of pattern you're repeating over and over again. We're just going to connect our blend here into the pattern 1 input of our tile sampler, and then we need to change the pattern to pattern input so that it recognizes what's going into this input at the top. Let's take the X and Y amount down quite a bit. I think we just need, let's do 3 by 3, and let's bring up the scale. That's too much. There you go. 2.28. Let's randomize the scale, just dragging all this to 1. Let's go to the position random. We can move these all over the place. And then let's rotate them randomly. So under rotation, rotation random. Great, 0.41. And so what you can do now is with every node in Substance Designer, there's a random seed. Just like if you double click the graph, you have a random seed that changes the entire graph's randomness, random seed here. Back in the tile sampler, you can see it also has its own random seed. So I can go here and I can just change the random seed of all of the random factors of this node. So I'm picking 2 there. That looks pretty cool. Hit spacebar. See, it's still tiles. And that should be everything we need. Let's just, if you want to borrow a connection or move, like if you don't want to scroll all the way back here and connect our tile sampler back to our final blend, you can hold Shift and click here, and it's just going to take those connections and pop them into here. And you see it automatically puts the blend still into the tile sampler, and you can see these are where our tendrils are going to be placed. Really cool. So let's frame this up now. Tendrils. And that should be all of our components for this material. So we've got our wall, veins, mounds. We've got the veins on the mounds, and then we have our tendrils. Don't forget to save. Okay, so we've created all of our components and all of their height values. Now it's time to blend them all together. So I've decided that I like to approach this material like a bunch of layers on top of one another. And Substance Designer has a really handy node called Height Blend, which allows you to think of each of these height components as layers like Photoshop. We can stack one on top of one another and even blend them so that they intersect where it makes sense to do so. It's really useful and also helps us out when we want to make some masks later on. So let's start off by creating our first height blend. So I'm going to click on my graph, spacebar, height blend. So the 2 inputs that we want to focus on for the height blend are the height top and the height bottom. These are the 2 layers that we can blend on top of one another. And the parameter that we're going to use is the height offset. And the height offset controls how high or low the height top is compared to the bottom. So the first two layers that we want to combine are the wall and the veins. I want the wall on the bottom, so I'm going to take the last blend here from the wall and put it into the height bottom input. Then I'm going to take the last node of our veins and drag that into the height top. I'm going to double click on the height blend. You can see what it does here. So let's see what we're doing in our 3D view. I'm just going to put the blended height output into our final blend. We can see what's going on here. And now notice that we have a little bit of an issue. We'll talk about that in a second. But what I want to do is take the height offset, and as we move this up, you can see the veins are going to be more prominent. And if I take it down, then the veins go underneath the wall. So this is an easy way to blend these two layers together with their height information. So I'm just going to make it so that these veins are resting on top of the wall, something like 0.63, and I'm going to crank the contrast all the way up to 1, and that's important for our masks later on. I'll show you that when we get to the masks. So like I said, we're having this issue here in our 3D view, in that right now we have pieces that take up a majority of our histogram, meaning that they have a wide range of grayscale values. Now, this is useful when they are the main or only layer of information in a material, but now that we're combining them, you can see that we're running into some problems. If I go to my materials menu in our 3D view and go back to, let's just go to edit here, you can see I can adjust the scale. Now, when I increase this height scale, our veins in our wall are kind of spiking out of proportion. Now, what we can do is we can use a histogram range node to compress all of our grayscale values so that they don't go crazy and stay within their respective height limits. So I'm going to start off, I'm going to look at the wall here and zoom in. And I'm going to select the connection between the last node in our wall and before our height blend. And I'll bring in a histogram range. Now right away you can see it started to do something. It's flattened out our grayscale values just a little bit. We can do this even further. I can take this range down. Something quite small. Let's go with 0.16. And then we can do the same thing here for our veins component. So I'm going to select that connection, bring in a histogram range, and then just bring down the values. So you can see that the veins are still popping out a little bit, but I'm just giving it some wiggle room because as we continue to add more height blends, it's going to compress this range a little bit further as we go. But already you can see that we're getting a much more realistic approach to our height and height scale just by adding these histogram ranges and controlling these values. So now that we've compressed everything, if I double click this height blend, you can see that our overall grayscale values are very flat. So let's bring everything back to a nice range of levels. And so I'm going to bring in an auto levels node. And there you go. As you can see now, it's popped up a little bit. What I can do is go into my materials and just edit again and just bring down the scale to get to something more comfortable. Now, next up, I want to add another histogram range after our auto levels. So histogram range. And so this is going to make it easier to treat the veins and wall as one layer while I add it to another height blend. So this way, when I change the height offset in this next height blend, the veins and wall will move together more cohesively as one layer. I'm going to select the connection after this histogram range and bring in another height blend. And it puts it in the center of this connection here. Let's just move this back over. So it automatically puts our histogram range into the height bottom, which is the default for a height blend. And now let's find our fungus mounds. Now I want to select the node at the end of our veins on fungus mounds because that's the end of this chain of nodes in our component here. So this is that auto levels that we have. Let's take that output from the auto levels and put it into the height top. Great. And so now let's double click the height blend. I'm going to bring the contrast to 1, and then we can play with this height offset. And now what I want to do is I want to go to my height scale again. So that's again materials, default, edit, and just bring up this scale quite a bit. So now we can see we've got our mounds and our veins. And as I change this height offset, if I increase this so that the fungus mounds are popping out a bit more, you can see it changes the scale in the histogram automatically for our wall and veins so that they kind of fit a little bit better. So I'm actually going to crank this height offset up a lot more. You can do something like 0.8. Let's go more. Let's see what we're doing here. Yeah, 0.88 looks good. And yeah, now the veins have flattened out a little nicer. And we can see everything starting to blend together really nicely. Now we have one last piece to add on. So that's going to be our tendrils up here. So like before, I'm just going to select the connection, height blend, move it over, and let's connect those tendrils to the height top. Okay, so this is a case where we're going to want to have these tendrils intersect as we blend things in. And so that's what this height offset's really useful at doing sometimes. Let's just bring the height offset down, and you can see that those tendrils are now pushing through the fungus mounds. Let's find a good value here. 0.18, and I'll put that contrast at 1. Yeah. So we've got some tendrils down here, and then we've got this nice big one going through everything. That's cool. So like before, I want to keep organized. I'm going to frame up all these nodes down here. That's the height blend, auto levels, histogram range, and these 2 other height blends. Frame that up and call it height. And I'm just going to color this as a dark value here. So next up, I want to organize this graph a little bit and just rearrange things so it's easy to work with in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this height frame over a little bit, and I'm just going to reorganize our outputs. So I know that next up, what I want to be working on is my color information and my roughness. So I'm going to move my color output nodes up a little bit, and also my roughness up here as well. And I'm just going to keep the normal and ambient occlusion, metalness, just keep them down here with this final blend. And so that's usually what I like to do. I like to keep my outputs in a nice column over here and then just work from left to right. So again, to review, we have our metallic and normal and ambient occlusion and height outputs connected down here with all of our height stuff. And then up here, we've got our base color and our roughness outputs over here. So we can kind of get all this nice space. Okay, so in order to easily target each of these components to change their color and affect their roughness values, I need to create a mask for each one. Now, the order of how we combine these pieces together in the height is really important. For instance, if I want to change the color of my veins, it might make sense to take the last node of this component and use something like a levels or a histogram. However, this doesn't take the layers on top of it into account, so you'll end up with red vein color projecting on top of the fungus mounds and tendrils. So we have to make sure to subtract the other pieces so that the mask applies to each component only where it is visible in the material. It's easiest to start from the bottom layer and work your way to the top, just like we did for the height. So let's start off by creating our wall mask. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to take our height frame and I'm going to extend it into our final blend here. This is all going to make sense in a second, just to keep our wires organized. And what I'm going to do is just make some room by just flattening this area out, just bringing some of these nodes over. So we've just got these nodes here, and then a height blend here for our tendrils, and then our final blend into these outputs. Now, to create the mask, I'm going to go to our first height blend. And you can see here, we've got an output here called height mask. If I double click on that, you can see where these 2 layers are intersecting. So that's what the blended height looks like. Here's the mask, and we can see our veins. And so right now the veins are white, but the wall is black. And we want the inverse of that. So we're going to take our height mask, And I'm just going to drag out a connection just over here somewhere. And I'm going to get an invert grayscale. Next up, I'm going to get a blend. And I'm going to connect our invert grayscale into the background. And what I want to do is I want to subtract the fungus mounds from our veins. So we can do that with our second height blend here. If I double click the height mask, you can see we have the outline of where our fungus mounds are in relation to the veins and wall that are on top of it. So I can take this height mask from our second height blend and put it into the foreground because that's what we're subtracting from our veins. So I'll take this blend and set it to subtract. We've got the wall in white and the veins and the fungus mounds in black. Finally, let's subtract the tendrils. So I'm just going to click on this blend and add another blend, set it to subtract. And then in the foreground, let's get our third height blend here with our tendrils height blend mask here. Just take that height mask in and put that into the foreground. So now we've subtracted the tendrils. So we've got the wall minus the veins, minus the fungus mounds, minus the tendrils. And that's just our wall mask. So I'm going to frame this up. I'm going to change it to something like purple and call this wall mask. And so this is the process that we're going to do to isolate each of our components. So next up, let's do the veins. So let's keep things a little more organized here. I just want to be able to see my connections pretty clearly. And what I can do is I can take this connection coming out of our height mask from our first height blend with the veins and wall, and I can hold Alt and add this little dot node. And this allows me to just move my wires around to make things a lot more easy to read. It also lets me split off connections like this from the same node here. So what I can do, essentially what I'm doing, is I'm taking another connection from the height mask that's coming from our height blend. And we already have the veins in white here. So I'm going to take that and put it into a blend. So now we have the veins in white, and we need to subtract our fungus mounds and our tendrils. So let's start off with the fungus mounds. That's from our second height blend. We got this height mask. Let's put that into the foreground. Set it to subtract. So now I've just got the veins, and let's add another blend and subtract those tendrils, which we know is in our third height blend here. Excellent. So I'm going to frame that up, make it purple, and veins mask. Let's isolate the fungus now with the mask. So we know we have the fungus here, height mask. Let's put that in a blend, and we just need to remove now the tendrils. So I'll take the tendrils out, subtract those. Excellent. And finally, we just need one connection for our tendrils. So I'm just going to branch off the height mask from our third height blend. Just make a blend here. I'm going to put this connection into the foreground by shift left clicking and just moving it into the foreground here. And then frame this up. Tendrils. So we now have our wall mask, the veins, the mounds, and the tendrils. So now let's focus on our roughness. I'm going to use a curvature-based roughness approach for this material, meaning where there are cavities and dips in the texture, it's going to be rougher. And where the texture sticks out, it's going to be a bit more shiny. With a lot of detail in the height information that we have here, this can make the texture pop a little more. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a family of nodes here to set up our roughness information and make it really easy to dial in exactly what we'd like. So let's start off with the wall. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the blend that doesn't involve our histogram range, so we get more of those values, and I'm going to branch off and get an auto levels. So we get all of that juicy grayscale height information. Next up, after the auto levels, I'm going to get a normal conversion node, the same node that we have over here creating our normal information for our outputs. So it's taking that height information and converting it into normal information. And now the reason why we have to do this is because of the next node that we're going to bring in. So I'm going to hit spacebar and bring in a curvature smooth node. And this curvature smooth node takes normal information, so I connect that in here, and it gives us a grayscale map of where everything curves and dips and creates those inlets. So we've got our curvature map now. Now, based on this curvature map, we can see that it's the opposite of what we're looking for, because in roughness terms, darker means it's shinier, and lighter or white means that it's rougher. And so right now we have the dark spots where we want the light spots. So let's invert that. So I'm going to get an invert grayscale. So now we can see that the parts that are sticking out are going to be shinier, and the parts that are in are going to be a little bit more rough. And then to add more control, I'm going to add a levels node. And we will adjust these levels nodes later on. So these 5 nodes we're going to add to all of our components. So I'm going to frame this up for now. I'm going to make this yellow, and I can call this wall roughness. And I'm just going to place it underneath here. And I'm going to do the same for all of our components. So for the veins, let's see how quickly we can get this done. I'm going to take not the histogram range, but the blur high quality grayscale at the end of our veins frame. Branch it off. Let's get an auto levels, followed by a normal, curvature smooth, invert grayscale, levels. Frame those up, veins roughness. Now for the fungus, we're going to go back to this veins on fungus mounts because that's where, again, this component ends. It's the last node here. Now it already has an auto levels, so we don't need to create a new one. So I'll just branch off a connection from that auto levels and start with the normal node, curvature smooth, invert, levels. Now what's interesting here, if we go into this normal and this curvature smooth, you can see we don't have that much information happening here. So what we can do is we can go to the normal node and we can change this intensity. Now I'm going to change this to something like 5. And now you can see this normal now has a lot more information, and then our curvature smooth now picks up that information. So we're getting a lot more detail in our roughness. So let's frame that up. Great. And now finally, let's do the same thing with our tendrils. Let's branch off from the tile sampler, auto levels, normal, and I'm going to change this intensity up to 5 as well. So we get more of that detail that we have here in our tendrils. Curvature smooth, invert, levels. And let's frame it up. Excellent. So what we can do is we can now use our masks to now combine these roughness controls that we've made and put them into our roughness output here. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is go to our roughness output. I'm just going to delete the uniform color that comes with the template. It's just going to make everything really shiny right now because it's automatically set to black. So what I want to do now near the roughness here is make a blend. And so I'm going to go find our wall roughness. We're going to do the same thing bottom to top like we did with our layers here in the height. I'm going to take the levels from our wall roughness frame here. And if I drag a connection and then press the Alt key, this allows me to create some dot nodes. I'm just doing this to keep things organized. So I'm just going to create some dots and just connect this to the foreground of the new blend we just created. So we have that levels from our wall roughness going into the foreground of this new blend. Now, the important part here is to find where do we want to apply this roughness information to. We want to apply it to just the wall. So let's get our wall mask. That's this blend here at the end of our wall mask frame. And we're going to take that blend and put it into the opacity input of this blend. So now we have that wall roughness information only applying to the wall. And so we're going to do this for the rest of our components. So let's make some room. I'm going to take all of our outputs and just slide this over. And I can adjust this just for my slight OCD here. I'm just going to move this frame over, take our final blend for our height over, so we have all this nice room to work with. So now, after this wall roughness blend that we have, I'm going to hit spacebar, add another blend. It puts that previous blend into the background. And so now let's get the roughness information for our veins. So here we go. Veins, the levels node, dragging out a connection, and just making some dot nodes. Putting it into the foreground of that blend. Set to copy, just like the other one. And now let's get that opacity mask. So we just want the veins. And let's plug that into that opacity mask. Perfect. Let's again make another blend. And now this is going to be our fungus mounds. So let's grab the roughness from the fungus mounds. Here's that levels. Drag off a connection. Just need to make one dot node for this one. And put that into the foreground of this blend. And let's get the mask for the mounds. Great, so now that roughness has been added, so the last thing we need to do now is the tendrils. Blend here. Let's get the tendrils roughness. Put that into the foreground, and then the tendrils mask into the opacity input of that blend. And finally, let's take that blend, that last one here in our roughness, and connect it into the roughness output. And now we're starting to see what we're getting here. Now it's not bad, but we can definitely adjust this more. So I know what I want to do is I definitely want to make it so that these tendrils are a lot more shiny. So I'm going to go to the levels in my tendrils roughness here. And here's where we can have some fun. So I can take this middle top triangle and I can slide this to the left or slide this to the right to adjust the overall roughness values here. You can see we've got really shiny tendrils now, so I can just shift this over. Get something slightly shiny just where things are poking out. Those are going to cause some nice highlights. And so for each of those components, we can just dial in these levels nodes. So I go into the mounds, for instance, go to the levels and adjust this one. And I can take the triangle in the middle at the top and just move it to the right if I want it to be a little bit shinier. That might be too shiny. I think I want these to be a bit more rough. Now the wall, let's take a look at the wall here. Let's see what we can do with that. So I'll go down to the wall roughness, change that levels, maybe move it to the right to make it a little bit shinier. I think that's okay. I don't want it too shiny, but what I do want to have be a bit shiny is the veins. So let's go to the veins levels and move that to the right. And now those are going to pop out. That's too much, but yeah, we can see what's going on there. Just a little bit. Great. Now there's one more thing I want to do, and that's add a little bit more diversity of roughness to the fungus mounds. So what I want to do is, let's go to the fungus mounds. Let's make some room here. We can bring in a grunge map here and blend it in on top of what we have so far. So I'll click here in the frame somewhere, bring in a grunge map. I think I'm going to stick with the grunge map 1.5 that we did before. Just good for this material. And what I can do is get a blend node, take what we have so far with the levels as the background, then we get the grunge map into the foreground, and I think what I want to do, we can try multiply. Let's do overlay. And then I'm just going to take the connection out of this levels, shift click, so I can borrow those connections and just pop it into this blend. So now it looks a bit crazy right now. We can adjust those levels, but it's going to diversify this. So let's go to the levels and let's bring this to the left. It's looking a bit slimy. So if you're going for a slimy material, that looks cool. I'm just going to make it a little more rough, and I want it to be a lot more solid. And that just breaks up those highlights a little more. Let's just organize this a little bit so it stays in the frame. So all I've done here is just blend in a grunge map from our levels in our roughness for the fungus mounts. Okay, so I've just gone through and added some dot nodes just to organize these connections so it's clear to see where everything is going. Now for the final piece of the puzzle, let's add some color. So this step is going to be very similar to the roughness. We've got all the masks we need. Now let's sample some colors and apply them using gradient map nodes. So we've got our roughness output here. We've got our base color output here. I'm just going to move this up, keeping everything in line with my outputs, just so we have some extra space up top. So like before, I'm going to remove the uniform color that came with the template. It's going to make everything black. This is a good way to look at your roughness as well. So starting off with the wall, I'm going to make another blend node. So blend right up here by my base color. And in the foreground here, I'm going to branch out a gradient map node here. It's at the top here when you hit spacebar. So with the gradient map node, it makes it really easy to take your height information as an input and then map it to a bunch of colors using this gradient editor. You can add keys, or you can sample keys by picking a gradient and dragging this across an image. That's pretty cool. All right, so let's clear that and let's get our reference. So here's my reference. I want to sample some colors from the wall. So I can go pick gradient, and I'm just going to drag across the wall. You can see it's picked some of these samples. And what I can do, if I just make this a little wider, I can change this precision slider to add more keys where I need it to go. So I've just gone ahead and added as much precision as I can with as many keys as I'd like. So let's close out of here. And now let's see what it's done. So I can connect this blend to the base color. It's going to color, like I was saying before, it's going to color the whole material in. So we need some of those masks. So let's go down, find our wall mask. And what I can do to keep things organized is I can just press Alt and get a pin or a dot node here and just branch off from the wall mask up to this opacity. So I can just move this over. And there we go. Now we're missing just one more piece, and that's when I mentioned that the gradient map takes our height information and then translates that into the color. So we just need to grab the height information from our wall. And we're going to take that from the auto levels from each of our bits of height information for each component because it has the most diverse and largest histogram grayscale values that we can use. So we'll branch off a connection. Just make some dot nodes here to keep it organized. And just connect it into our gradient map. So now it's mapping those grayscale values to these keys that we've defined. And now we start to get that color information in our wall. So now we get to do the same thing for all the other components. So I'm going to select the connection here after our blend and our base color input. Bring in a new blend, get another gradient map node. And so I'll grab the mask from our veins. That's the next one that we need to do. Put a dot node here after our veins mask. Connect it into the opacity input of this second blend. And now let's get the height information from our veins. So we've got our auto levels from our veins roughness frame here. Let's just keep things nice and straight and linear here. Just connect that into the gradient map. And so now we can pick some more keys from our reference of the veins. So I'm going to go and bring up the reference, pick gradient, and I can pick some of these red veins here. And we can see what's going on as we do it in our 3D view. If you'd like, you can select all these keys, and then you have a hue, saturation, and value sliders here. So if you want, you can brighten these up with the value, or you can increase or decrease the saturation right here. That's looking good. Great. Do the same thing for the fungus. New blend, gradient map. And we're running out of room here, so I'm just going to slide these over a little bit. So let's go to the fungus mounds, put a pin in there, and branch off that mask into the opacity of our new blend. Let's find the height information for the fungus mounds. We're going to branch off from the auto levels to get all that information. Connect it into the gradient map. And let's get the gradient editor and a reference, and I can just sample some more keys. Okay. That's looking good. I had to match it with the reference. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Finally, let's add the tendrils. So another blend, another gradient map. Let's grab the mask. Here it is, tendrils. Into the opacity. Tendrils is up here. Let's get the auto levels. Very repetitive part of the process. And then pipe it into the gradient map. The tendrils are pretty similar to the mounds. We can sample some colors here. They look a little bit darker. Pick a gradient. Okay. Those tendrils are looking a bit too shiny, so I'm just going to go and find the tendrils roughness and just bring this to the left a little bit. See what we're doing. It's better. And so that is our color for the material. So let's do a quick overview of what we've done. So we've created all of our components here, all the height information first. So we start with the wall, we did some noises, we got some veins, we did a really cool vein generation technique. Then we have the fungus mounds where we use some tile generators and some warps. And we added some flakes using a slope flare and a bunch of other tools here. We sculpted out some detail, and then we added some veins on top of those mounds. And we added some tendrils by using some shapes and a non-uniform blur, warped those around, tiled those with a different tile node called the tile sampler, and we combined them all together with height blends and histogram ranges. Then to control where we wanted to put our roughness and color, we created a bunch of masks by utilizing the feature in the height blend, the height mask output. And that really helps us out here where we can subtract out pieces and get all the masks that we need. We then used a curvature-based roughness approach where we started off by getting all of our grayscale information within auto levels, feeding that into a normal conversion node, and then using the curvature smooth, inverting it, and using the levels to control it, where we then use those masks to combine everything together to get our roughness map. We did the same thing with our color information, except this time we used those masks and a gradient map to sample keys from a reference and also take that height information to apply those keys in the proper place. We blended those all together to get our albedo color map here. So now that we've created our material, it's time to play with the system that we've created. For instance, I can adjust the veins by adding more or less information. So let's go into our veins section here. And remember, we can use this levels and the histogram scan nodes to change the data. So I can move this, for instance, to the left, and we can get less veins, or I can move this to the right, and we can get a lot more of those veins appearing in here. I can also go to the histogram scan node, and I can add more or less of those circles and holes just by dragging these sliders. Also, remember I talked about that random seed parameter. So if I double click on the graph, let's zoom out here, I can change this random seed. We can get a completely different version of this material here that we can then blend with the other versions. Try another one. This one's cool. You can see we've got these veins branching out into two. That's awesome. And with Substance Designer, you're not just creating textures, but you're creating these systems, creating these small programs in a way, so that you can create an unlimited variation of this material. Now, if you want to export these outputs to image files, the quickest way to do that is to go to this little wrench icon here above the top of the graph, click that and choose Export Outputs. Then you can choose which of these outputs you'd like to export and what file format you'd like to change it to. Then choose Export Outputs, and here is what our finished material looks like. And with that, we have our material inspired by The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2. The approach that we used in this material was to treat everything like components and layers, much like Photoshop, and then use Substance Designer's Height Blend node to tie everything together. As we added each layer on, the graph got a lot more complex, so keeping organized is key here. Using dot nodes and frames to keep things nice and clear is really useful when you're working, but also when you need to go back to the graph later and figure out whatever it is that you did. I'm really excited to see where this series goes. I've got a bunch of ideas on which games I'd like to make materials from, but if you have any other ideas, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to see what it is you're interested in. Hey, look at that, a magical coffee appeared. Now, if you like this video, hit the thumbs up. It lets me know that you're watching and that you like tutorials like these. And if you'd like to see more Substance Designer tutorials and other future texturing videos from me, hit subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when I post new videos. I've got an interesting video coming up that's a little more hardware based and an exciting announcement coming soon. So stay tuned. I'm Jeremy Seiner. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.